This is Hubwonk. I'm Joe Selvaggi. Welcome to Hubwonk, a podcast of Pioneer Institute, a think tank in Boston. How should we greet the news that on November 15th, 2022, the world's population reached 8 billion people? For generations, our concerns about the growing world population were based on dire predictions, such as those of biologist Paul Ehrlich, whose 1971 highly influential book, Population Bomb, bluntly asserted that, quote, "You can't continue to grow forever on a finite planet," unquote. Going further to contend that, quote, "The biggest problem we face is the continued expansion of the human enterprise," unquote. However, 50 years later, with a global population twice that of 1971, the availability of essential resources, as measured in their real price decline, has steadily increased. Indeed, by any measure, the imminent scarcity suggested by a finite planet seems to be moving further away beyond the horizon of our world of global abundance. What accounts for the disconnect between the former certainty that population growth is unsustainable and the observable reality that resources have never been more plentiful? My guest today is Marian Tupy, editor of humanprogress.org, senior fellow at the Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity, co-author of the Simon Abundance Index, and co-author of the recently released book, Superabundance, the story of population growth, innovation, and human flourishing on an infinitely bountiful planet. Mr. Tupy will share with us how, where, and when mankind broke from those constraints that naturally bind the populations of all other living organisms. He will explain the implications and the power of the idea that our future prosperity lies in the unlimited resources of human ingenuity. Contrary to the ubiquitous narrative of human population unsustainability, Mr. Tupy will describe how a finite planet in the hands of an increasing number of human minds creates the potential for an infinitely abundant future. When I return, I'll be joined by scholar and author Marian Tupy. Okay, we're back. This is Hubwonk. I'm Joe Selvaggi, and I'm now pleased to be joined by the editor of humanprogress.org, senior fellow at the Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity, and co-author of the Simon Abundance Index at Cato, and co-author of the recently released book, Superabundance, the story of population growth, innovation, and human flourishing on an infinitely bountiful planet, Marian Tupy. Welcome to Hubwonk, Marian.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, I've been excited for this conversation. I'm a big fan of your work, a big fan of human progress. And for what it's worth, now it's the holiday season. I'm giving your earlier book, the Global Trends Every Smart Person, 10 Global Trends Every Smart Person Should Know. I'm giving them as Christmas gifts. So I'll lay that out there for our listeners to know that this is not an unbiased interpretation of your work.
Thank you.
So let's start with your book. It's Superabundance. I think it's both a provocative, perhaps maybe a confusing title for some. Let's start with two concepts right in the title: superabundance and the fact that we live on an infinitely bountiful planet. So what is superabundance?
Superabundance has a technical meaning. We measure abundance. We don't measure scarcity. We measure abundance in a sense of how much more stuff can people buy per hour of labor. And an abundance can grow at different rates. So in our framework, we always ask, how fast is the population growing, and what is happening to abundance? Essentially, the view that we are attacking is that with increase of population, things are going to become less abundant. And looking at hundreds of different commodities going back all the way to 1850 in some cases, we see that all of them are increasing in abundance. Nothing is becoming less abundant. Everything is becoming more abundant. But when abundance is growing at lower rate than population growth, we just call it abundance. When abundance is growing at a faster rate than population, we call that superabundance. So if the population of the world or population of a country is growing, say, at 2%, but abundance is growing at 3 or 4%, we call that superabundance, because abundance is increasing at a faster pace than population. And that's important because if population is growing at 2%, but superabundance is growing, or abundance is growing at 3 or 4%, that tells us, that gap tells us that humans are producing more than they are consuming. That tells us that every new human being that comes into the world comes not only with an empty stomach, but also with a brain capable of increasing wealth for everybody else.
Well, I can hear in our audience already a gasp is saying, okay, listen, are you confronting reality? We all are either professional or amateur economists. The premise there is infinite demand, limited resources. How could it be that the more people we have, the more stuff we're consuming, given we have a finite planet, we're hurling through space on this big blue marble? How is it that the more people we have and the more stuff each of those people consumes means there's more stuff to be consumed? How is that intuitively? It's intuitively difficult to comprehend, but what is the basis? How do you measure that we're getting more abundant?
Right. So we measure everything in time prices, meaning we don't measure in dollars and cents, which also allows us to transcend the problem of inflation. And it also allows us to transcend the problem of intertemporal comparisons, meaning an hour of labor today is the same as it is in China. So you can do it across countries, but it's also the same as it was in 1850. If you are spending an hour at work, then it's the same as if you did it in 1800s. So we use these time prices. How long does it take you work in order to buy something? If 50 years ago it took you an hour to buy a gallon of milk, but today it's down to 10 minutes, that means that you have become better off.
So I just want to, that's a very important concept that's foundational to your work here, so that we want to account for, let's say, the difference between nominal and real prices, right? That's how we adjust for inflation. What does something cost today that 1950, what it would cost then in those dollars? So that's inflation. But you're solving for something more important, which is if we become more productive, we need, let's say, we need to spend less time working. If we need to spend 10 minutes a day working to meet our needs, whereas we in the past needed 8 hours, we've become substantially wealthier. Even if those products stay the same, we'd be wealthier. But because those products perhaps are less expensive, we're doubly or exponentially more wealthy. Do I have that about right?
That's correct. So the problem with nominal and real prices go well beyond just adjusting them for inflation. That is a problem on its own. Nobody trusts the inflation statistics. Even people at BLS understand that the inflation statistics are deeply problematic. Everybody understands that. I'm not some sort of a conspiratorial guy that the government is lying outright. It's just very difficult to get it right. What exactly is the level of inflation, how much you weigh different items to each other, etc. So we move beyond inflation by not looking at dollars and cents. We look at time, which is constant for regular human interactions, and it is independent of human perception. And hour is the same no matter how you look at it. Now, the other problem with nominal and real prices is that productivity shows itself not only in the prices of goods and services, but also in wages. So to get a sense of how fast you are getting, how far you are getting in life, to get a sense of standards of living, you have to account for both. The fact that wheat, as a result of productivity gains in agriculture, is getting cheaper, so the prices are declining, but the wages are also increasing at the same time, right? The farmer who is collecting the wheat, for example, may be earning $120,000, $150,000 driving a very sophisticated machine, as opposed to a peasant 300 years ago who had a sickle and maybe whatever. So time prices are this beautiful way of putting together both gains in productivity, goods, and also wages. And it's by dividing the nominal price of a good in a store, a loaf of bread, by the nominal hourly wage, that you get that time price. So I think that's a very important thing.
Can I also, again, many of our listeners are not schooled in economics, but I think a very powerful mechanism that everyone should understand is the price mechanism. You use this price mechanism to determine the scarcity of a product. I know in the first day of economics, often rhetorically, the teacher will say, why is it that water that we need is vital for our life? We can go on less than a day without it. That's free, but gold that we don't need at all, even to fill our fillings in our mouth, that's a very, very expensive commodity. Therefore, there's really no relationship between price and necessity. Rather, price indicates something else. In your book, you assert it indicates relative scarcity. Share with our listeners what that concept is.
Well, we try to get away from measuring scarcity in a sense that because scarcity is infinite. In fact, I think it's in chapter 3, we say we are not going to measure scarcity because human desires are infinite. Things are always going to be scarce relative to human desires. But we can measure abundance. We can measure how much better off we are today as opposed to yesterday. In terms of if you are comparing apples with apples. So a pound of beef today is essentially the same as it was in 1850. And by looking at this time price, what we can say is that for the same amount of work that a blue-collar worker needed to work in 1850 to get a pound of beef, he can now get 8 pounds of beef. So in that sense, in terms of beef abundance, he or she is 8 times better off. So that's how we are going. That's how we try to get around the issue of scarcity, and of course, scarcity is relative because whether things are scarce or not also very much depends on what is happening to a price mechanism that you have said. When things suddenly become more expensive, human ingenuity jumps into it and starts lowering those prices in a variety of ways. For example, if oil suddenly quadruples in price, as it did in the early 1970s, people start producing cars that consume less oil. The other thing that you can do is to substitute something for something else. So instead of using oil in order to power our electric generating facilities, we can switch to natural gas. The other thing, anyway, I realized that there was a question in the previous segment that I didn't answer, and that is that why is it that people don't understand this business with bountiful planet as opposed to a highly restricted planet? And I think that the issue here, and it really ties to resources very closely, is that it is true that the planet only has a finite number of atoms on it, atoms of zinc or copper or whatever. But the value that you can derive from those atoms is potentially infinite, hence the word infinitely bountiful planet. If you take something as simple as a grain of sand, we realized 4,000 years ago that you could turn it into glass, which people used for glass beads and later jars and window panes. But today we are using glass in microchips and fiber optic cables. So here you can see how with every step of the way, the value derived from sand has increased massively. And in 200 or 2,000 years, goodness knows what we are going to be using sand for. So that's the fundamental difference between the finitude of atoms, which is how most people perceive the world. We have a finite number of atoms, but economists look at what can you do with those atoms. And the reality is by recombining them and combining them and recombining them, you can actually create an infinite amount of value.
I love where we're going with this. Let's take a step back and talk about, let's say, what the context of these assertions, or perhaps the water we're swimming in, is this sort of general notion that we believe we are on a finite planet, that conservation is essential component of long-term survival. But that's all sort of with the backdrop. I know from my sort of history of economics education that Thomas Malthus, more than 100 years ago, essentially looked at the world and said, look, we're growing exponentially. We each have 2 kids, and the world is growing rapidly, and the ability to support those people are going, let's say, geometrically. We don't have twice as many fields to support twice as many or 4 times as many people. Eventually, we're going to run out of resources to feed everyone. Fast forward to modern times, your book quotes quite liberally the famous, I think he's still around, Paul Ehrlich, who wrote The Population Bomb, who saw, I don't know, 6 billion people. I don't know how many people were there now. There then said, look, we're at the precipice of global starvation. We need to do something about it. Set the stage for our listeners. What is or was the world of economic scarcity? Why did we think that we weren't on an infinitely abundant planet?
Yes, so Malthus wrote his famous essay on the principle of population in 1798, so over 200 years ago. And basically, he was claiming that the population growth was always going to outpace resource growth or innovation, if you will, and therefore there was going to be starvation. In this book, I think we do a good job in disproving that, showing that everything is becoming more abundant. Most historians would agree that, or most economists would agree that Malthus was a decent historian because he described the world as it was up till 18th century. Was that essentially whenever you had a massive population expansion, at some point it would run up against resource constraints. So maybe with increased number of people, you started expanding the agricultural enterprise until you started using marginal land which was producing less food, etc. And so you have good earth, you have worse earth, you have very poor earth, and at some point, there were so many people, and they started using all this marginal land. Maybe there was climatic change or bad harvests. The harvests collapsed for a couple of years and starvation ensued, right? And I think that is generally a good way to sort of think about it, because if you look at population around the world prior to 1800s, it really did go through these cycles. At the time of Caesar Augustus or Christ, there was about 400 million people in the world. Then it grows, and then it falls, then it grows, and then it falls, etc. But it's only in 1800 that you get to the first billion, and since 1800 we have reached 8 billion, and yet everything in terms of food and other resources is getting cheaper. So that means that something profound has happened in the 18th century, and in fact, I would argue that, in fact, we show it in the book, that even while Malthus was still writing his book, things were already changing. As the population of England expanded massively in the 18th century, prices of wheat and flour were actually decreasing, which is very similar to actually what happened to Marx. Marx was writing at the time about immiseration of the working classes, and by the time he died, it was undeniable that actually working class wages were increasing. So it's just this kind of weird symmetry where people who thought that they've discovered some sort of laws of history were proven wrong even before they died.
So they were the laws of history until that time, and then there was an inflection point. We maybe call it the Industrial Revolution. I don't know if you would characterize that as the sort of what would be the inflection point. Again, bringing it to modern time, Paul Ehrlich, I think, was a biologist. He was sort of taking the wisdom not of the centuries, but rather of organisms, whether it's yeast or bacteria or mice or any sort of rabbits in Australia. Organisms reproduce until they run out of food and die off. Why would human beings be any different? Essentially, I think that was his foundation for his observation that we're in for worse time.
The dividing line here between economists and biologists is actually quite staggering. Even people whom I greatly admire, like Brett Weinstein and his wife Heather Haling, they are biologists, and they are fully on board with this Malthusian stuff, writing in 2021, 2022. And it's a very interesting thing. They don't understand, or they seem not to comprehend, that human beings truly are fundamentally different from other animals. We are not like rats or yeast in a petri dish. We are intelligent animals, able to plan forward, and very importantly, to innovate. It is not that animals cannot use tools. Some of them can, monkeys and sticks and things like that. But you don't see them innovating over their lifetimes or over, long periods of time. Once they have figured out how to use a stick to shove it in a heap of ants and things like that, they don't go on then discovering new ways of getting to ants and eating them. So human beings are fundamentally different. We are intelligent creatures. We have the theory of mind and things like that, and that means that we can innovate. And I think that's a very and we've shown that. So how did we get around the problem of Malthusian scarcity? Well, at some point in the 19th century, we discovered guano, and we discovered that we are able to take essentially bat and bird poop and fertilize our fields with it, which was high in potassium and nitrogen. And then when that became expensive, Haber and Bosch discovered creation of artificial or synthetic fertilizers, ammonia, which is derived from natural gas. And it is in this way that we are able to produce more and more food on fewer and fewer acres of land, which will also allow us to turn a lot of land back over to nature. And therefore, we can have in the future both an environmentally clean and sound planet as well as plentiful food.
I want to tip our hat to the sort of the bravery of some of the intellectuals, let's say on our side of the continuum, that one comes to mind is Julian Simon, who made a bet with Paul Ehrlich, the biologist, Julian Simon being an economist, saying, look, if it's true that we're running out of everything as the population goes up, theoretically, as the next pound of a material becomes more scarce and more dear, its price ought to go up. So they made a bet and they said, look, you pick the 5 items you think are going to become more scarce and therefore more expensive. We'll make a bet. Let's meet in 10 years and let's see what happens. I think your book in many ways is a sort of an expansion of this bet, this argument, this proof that we are not bound by some Malthusian constraint. So share with our listeners that bet and the implications for your work.
Well, yes, as you implied, the courage of Julian Simon is very important to understand, to place him in time. You see, Julian Simon was going against the zeitgeist in the 1970s and the 1980s, especially in the 1960s and the 70s. This is important because the entire world was enamored with Paul Ehrlich's population bomb and believed that overpopulation was going to be a problem. And Julian Simon looked at the numbers and said, this is not going to happen. And the bet, as you said, was for $1,000 of 5 metals, which Ehrlich chose. Tungsten, chromium, tin, zinc, something else. And in 10 years' time, the inflation-adjusted price fell by 36%. And even though the population of the world obviously expanded massively, and Ehrlich had to send him a check for $576. So yes, he's certainly the intellectual giant of his work we are working, but also we think that we are not necessarily improving, perhaps improving on the bet, in a sense that we think that time price is more important than real price, which Paul and Simon worked with real prices. But we think that time price is actually more important because it takes into account also the productive gains in wages that real prices ignore.
I think that's a very important point, this time price concept. Again, we've touched on it earlier. But what I found profound is, again, you expanded on this by you have in your book 18 data sets which talk about other commodities, because one can anticipate a critique of the Simon Ehrlich bet, which is they took the wrong 5 items, perhaps, or they took too short of a time frame. So let's take all kinds of items, that people from all economic strategies from all over the world, and let's expand it many, many more years. And your book does a fine job of that. There's lots of data, lots of charts that illustrate this. What I think is most profound about this,
which is not to say that there cannot be temporary reversals. In fact, right now, prices are increasing at a faster pace than wages, which has not been the case for 40 years. So commodities are actually increasing in price relative to wages. But therefore, the more numbers you have and the longer time periods you take, the better for your research. Now, our sort of golden rule was, look at all of these data sets that are out there and choose the ones with most commodities over as long period of time as possible, and see where it lands. In other words, only then run it through the program and see what the numbers are. But we always started with that goal in mind. And when you get to places like 1850 and you look at blue-collar wages and you see that things are generally falling, things have generally fallen by, somewhere between 97 and 99% in terms of time price. So instead of 100 minutes to buy something, you now have to pay 1 minute to buy something. And that tells us that there is really a long-term, continuous, contained drop in prices, increased productivity, increased welfare.
I think what's powerful about that is in this current world where inequality or equity are sort of household names that describe all the problems of the world. I think when we're comparing our condition now to, say, Elon Musk or Bill Gates, they've got hundreds of billions and I've got what I've got. That seems, for me, to engender for many people envy or resentment. If we compare our lot in life, the Joes and the Marians of 1850, and we compare what we do, how much we work, and what we can buy with that work, we are rich beyond our wildest dreams. I think that engenders a sense of gratitude. Is that what you were looking for with these time series where you see what one average, let's say, either working class, unskilled, I think, and blue collar, I forget all the different metrics, but it was a lot of unskilled, skilled, and upskilled that you compared so that everybody was accounted for. Share more about this sort of intertemporal comparison versus contemporary comparisons.
Yes, well, the fundamental thing to understand, and Don Boudreaux has written about this, the economist from GMU, that 100 years ago, you could spot a rich man walking down the street versus a poor man just by the way they dressed. A rich man could afford a suit. Poor man would be walking around in work overalls or whatever. There was a visible difference. The difference in how Elon Musk can dress and I can dress is on our massively diverse incomes has shrunk. The inequality in clothing has shrunk to almost invisible, if at all. Similarly with food, rich people simply ate very different things than poor people did. Poor people survived on, bread, water, whatever, very little access to meat, etc. Maybe rich people today can still get their fill of caviar, which I cannot. But the reality is that the inequality in terms of their richness of food and our richness of food has also shrunk dramatically. And all over the world, different types of inequalities are disappearing. Because progressives are so heavily fixated on income inequality, they ignore inequalities like child mortality in poor countries and rich countries has shrunk. Life expectancy inequality between rich and countries has shrunk heavily. There are all sorts of other inequalities, access to information, access to clean water, where there was a massive gap and which have now declined. So I think that we are doing ourselves a disservice by basically conceding to the progressives the high moral ground by helping them to focus just on income inequality. There are other inequalities which have almost disappeared. Now, yes, so in the book, I maintain that depending on your your venture point or your vantage point, you can decide whether to be miserable and envious or whether you can be grateful and happy. If you compare today, where we are today in America in 2022, and you compare it with any other period in the past, then we can see massive progress along most, if not all, dimensions of human progress or human well-being. And therefore, you know, the feeling that should fill you is one of gratitude. If, however, you compare America in 2022 with a utopia where everything is working out for everyone, everywhere, at all times, then the only emotion can be one of disappointment and resentment that the society is deeply imperfect, and that is also connected to envy. If you compare yourself only to the richest people in the world today, you know, how the Kardashians live, then you're envious. But if you compare yourself with 99.9% of the people who ever live, the alternative emotion is gratitude. And it's not entirely clear why, or rather, it is clear why, but you have a lot of control over whom you compare yourself to. I mean, if you compare yourself to a tall, incredibly handsome man with bulging muscles, with a hot girlfriend, flying around on a jet, then on a private jet, then obviously you're going to be miserable. But perhaps you should be comparing yourself to other people, perhaps even to yourself from 5 or 10 years ago, and see how much progress you have made in your life.
Indeed, that's a positive way to look at it. But I'll say, you know, for those listeners who dismiss our concern that Malthus and Ehrlich, their views are alive and well, there seems to be a sense, both globally, politically, and within our culture, that more people is bad, meaning we know the disastrous policies within China, the one-child policy. I don't know how many tens or hundreds of millions of people don't exist because of that constraint.
400
also, how many?
400 million.
400 million. That's more than the population of the United States don't exist because of that one policy. But also, you know, again, maybe it's the circles I run in, but when someone's having more kids or lots of kids, it seems implied that they're bringing them both into a world that's getting worse, and that the fact that they're having children or many children is making a bad situation even worse, meaning we're telling young people that children are part of the problem, ergo you ought not to have them. It seems that, you know, for all the good work of your book and the observations that child is very likely to be doing better than his parents in a more abundant world, we still seem to think things are getting worse and those kids are putting gas on a fire. What are your views on that?
Well, I think it's the height of insanity. I mean, if you're just looking at the environment, for example, aside from the fact, let's put aside all the good things that are happening on the environmental side. More fish that we consume are aquaculture fish rather than wild. We have record number of natural reserves in the world where animals can roam freely. We have record amount of oceans or acreage or square mileage of oceans, which is protected from human exploitation. We have record number of trees in the United States. We haven't had this many trees in 200 years. There are all sorts of things which are improving on the environmental front. But ultimately, if you don't have human beings in the world, then what does it matter whether the environment in the world is good or bad? If the world is not there to be perceived through human senses, then it might as well not exist. It's irrelevant, because the only intelligent entity capable of appreciating the trees and the ocean and the marine life, etc., is the human brain. Animals don't care about the natural beauty of the world. They care about eating and having sex and not being eaten by other animals. And so but I do see that you can't open a newspaper, especially progressive newspaper like the New York Times or Washington Post or the Atlantic, without constantly seeing a barrage of articles claiming that we are cancer on the planet, that bringing a child into the world is an act of selfishness, that their future is going to be bad. Look, the work that I do does not guarantee that everything is going to work out. But if you just take the last 2 years of COVID and put it on the side, this is the best time to be alive. And that's not just true for the West. It's also true for other parts of the world, even in Africa, where the GDP per capita is much higher than it was, say, 50 years ago. Whether you are a woman, a girl born into the world, you have many more opportunities than your mothers and your grandmothers. If you are a gay boy born into the world, your chances in life are much better than they were before. If you are an atheist in the world, your chances of succeeding in life are much better than it was when religion ruled the roost. If you are an indigent person, there is a record amount of money to make sure that you don't have to starve or freeze. If you simply enjoy life, you have many more years to do so than our ancestors did. So there's just so much positive news, and again, it's very discouraging to see that so few people understand it or appreciate it. Partly it's the education system. We no longer teach economics or history to our high schoolers, let alone economic history. Very few people understand how difficult life was before. They sort of think that life before industrialization was this happy, bucolic existence where you got to milk the cow in the morning and you got to pet the sheep in the evening, and food was just magically materialized and heating and cold. And anyway. I'm getting sidetracked, but I'm still a believer, partly because I grew up in a world which had very little. By looking at the West and seeing how much the Western people have accomplished, it fills me with tremendous joy and happiness.
Well, this is a good segue to, we're getting close to the end of our time together, but at the top of the show, you talked about the fact that as population grows, so does I guess our productivity, and so does the abundance of the resources we use. So we get richer and richer with more and more people. And your advice is, boy, go out there and prosper and have lots more people. That should excite grandparents, grandmothers everywhere, that we're encouraging them to go out and have as many babies as possible. But more people is necessary, but not sufficient. In other words, the next Steve Jobs or Newton or Einstein is out there, but it's not enough just to be out there. They have to have some measure of freedom. Otherwise, they may be stuck in a village with no education, no communication. Share with our listeners, beyond more people and on this infinitely abundant planet, what else do we need besides more people?
Just to quickly backtrack, obviously as a classical liberal, I sort of feel that people should have as many children as they want. The point of the book is to tell people, if you are concerned about running out of resources and you are making your decisions about family size based on that, then you don't have to do that. In other words, we are not going to run out of resources. The future is most likely to be better than the past, and therefore, have as many babies as you want. If you wanted to take a utilitarian perspective on that, and of course, the more people you have, the more years of happiness and the more life years you have. That's good in and of itself as well. But yes, the basic equation in superabundance, it's population times freedom. Population is important because if you don't have human beings, you don't have new ideas, you don't have innovation, you don't have productivity gains, and therefore increases in standards of living. But clearly, population is not the only thing that matters. If it was, then China would be the most prosperous country for the last 2,000 years because they've been the most populous country for the last 2,000 years. So you need to have freedom. Freedom, most importantly, to speak, to think, to speak, to publish, to associate, to exchange ideas, but also economic freedom. You need to be able to implement your ideas, your inventions and your innovations in the marketplace and see which inventions swim and which sink. Very important that government shouldn't be picking winners and losers in the marketplace. Very important that the price mechanism, the autonomy of the price mechanism should be preserved so that we know which inventions and innovations are actually useful and which are useless. So freedom is very important. If Steve Jobs, his father, wasn't able to move from Syria to the United States, we might never have gotten Apple. So, right. Yeah.
Here we are on two apples, I think. So again, we're at the end of the show. Your conclusions are very, very powerful. Do you see, again, the world is, we just passed 8 billion people, I think, last week. Congratulations, mankind. And we seem somewhat free and getting freer. Your book doesn't suggest that it's inevitable that we all just become more prosperous and infinitely abundant. There are things that could derail this trend that has persisted over the last 200 years. What do you see, again, briefly at the end of the show? What should we be wary of? What could throw us off track and perhaps plunge us into the wrong direction, away from abundance?
Yeah, I mean, there had been previous efflorescences of prosperity, be it in ancient Rome or Song China, the medieval Italian states, and they eventually got snuffed out. The Italian city-states like Venice and also Song China remind us that elites play a very important role in either enhancing or destroying innovation, and therefore destroying human well-being. If an elite like in the Ming dynasty in China, they decided to basically cut themselves off from the rest of the world. They decided to shut down their economic growth because they perceived economic growth to be destabilizing to the society. We are seeing something very similar with Xi in China right now, where he's explicitly committed to destroying innovation, economic innovation and economic growth, because he believes that it's destabilizing to the control of the Communist Party over the Chinese state. So the elites could snuff it out. Something similar is happening in Europe right now, where the European elite got so enamored with green energy and net zero that they have basically destroyed their economic growth and are in the process of destroying their societies by abolishing access to cheap energy. So what do we need? First of all, we need freedom of speech, so that you are able to tell your government what you are doing is a mistake. You can call me a denier, you can call me all sorts of names, but I should still be allowed to say that the green agenda, which you currently have, I'm not against green agenda as a rule, but the current green agenda can lead only to a societal destruction, and therefore freedom of speech is very important. The other thing which is very important is freedom of the marketplace. Once again, once governments start to pick winners and losers in the marketplace, that's not a good way of encouraging economic growth. So that's important. And lastly, I would say it's this anti-humanism, anti-natalism, which we are seeing among some elites. In the New York Times, Washington Post, stories about how we should limit number of people on the planet and we should limit their consumption. This is a deeply anti-human message with which I fundamentally disagree. And this nexus, which is appearing in Western democracies between people who believe in degrowth, meaning not just lower economic growth rates, but actually lower economic smaller economy overall. And these same people have the power to bring it about by restraining our innovation, our energy consumption. And the same people are also the ones who are writing the articles and reading the articles about how human beings are a problem for the planet. It's a small sliver of society, I suspect, but they have a huge impact on how people around the world perceive the world. And if they can scare us into basically stop breeding, stop innovating, stop using energy, and embrace poverty, then the world's future will be very dark indeed.
Indeed. Well, I wanted to end on a more positive view, but that's where we have it. You've been very generous with your time. I appreciate it. I think
my absolute pleasure. But also, that's why we are here, to push back against that. This is the environmentalism is just the last iteration of anti-liberal, anti-humanist ideologies that have come before. This is not new. Just like Hayek and Mises had to fight fascism and communism and Nazism, Jefferson and Burke had to fight against feudalism and aristocracy, we have to fight against extreme apocalyptic environmentalism. That's our job, and I think that we are going to win in the end. So that's the positive spin on things.
Well, I agree. We just did a show a scientist who effectively said, look, climate-related deaths have been coming down for the last 100 years, though we've been warming. There's no reason to expect they wouldn't continue to decline as we adapt. We become wealthier and therefore more resilient, and therefore the future is brighter regardless of what climate changes happen to us. And we have to remain optimistic that human beings are, and human ingenuity is the greatest power in the universe. So I hope that's a good message for our listeners.
Very good one.
All right. Thank you very much, Marian.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
This has been another episode of Hubwonk. If you enjoyed today's episode, there are several ways to support Hubwonk and Pioneer Institute. It would be easier for you and better for us if you subscribe to Hubwonk on your iTunes podcatcher. If you want to help make it easier for others to find us, it would be great if you offer a 5-star rating or a favorable review. We're always grateful if you want to share Hubwonk with friends. If you have ideas or suggestions or comments for me about topics for future Hubwonk episodes, you're welcome to email me at hubwonk@pioneerinstitute.org. Please join me next week for a new episode of Hubwonk.